Hi, and welcome to the Capital Forum's Antitrust Interview Series sponsored by Kroll Discovery. I'm Nate Soderstrom. I'm here today with Cliff Aronson. Cliff is a partner in the New York office of Skadden, Arps, Slate, Meagher, and Flom. Cliff, thanks for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
So we're talking a bit about agency merger review and trends. Just at the outset, over the past 18, 24 months, there's a view that the agencies have become more aggressive. You've seen number of full stop challenges, number of litigated merger challenges. Has that been your sense in your practice that the agencies over the past couple of years have taken a harder line on transactions?
I don't actually think they've taken a harder line, in my view, and I don't think the numbers actually bear out a harder line. I think what's happening is, what I'm noticing is a lot of companies are actually negotiating a very unfavorable antitrust provision, which requires them to go the full length of the investigation and potentially to litigation. And as a result, sometimes they're forced in a situation where they have to litigate and where the agencies are suing rather than doing something else. So I think that's the primary issue. The other thing is that I think for some reason people got gutsy and started doing deals that any of us who do antitrust every day would say, are you kidding? I mean, that won't get done.
Right. So it's not so much a function of the agencies taking a harder line as you have more deals that are maybe pushing the envelope that are leading to situations where you see litigation.
That's my view, and part of that may be just the nature of the merger guidelines, which are more reasonably written with lots of, when they first came out, I thought this is just a menu in favor of the government. But actually the economic approach and the natural experiments are actually things we can all use in private practice to help a very difficult deal get through, and use the guidelines against the government. So I actually think they've been helpful in some deals that I wouldn't have considered before. The guidelines have actually helped us get them through.
Interesting. I think one area where the agencies, I think, almost certainly have taken a harder line are fixes, whether it's structural fixes, whether it's behavioral, whatever it is, but especially on the structural side, buyer suitability, asset packages, TSA, that kind of thing. Wondering what you've seen there. Have you seen the agencies take a harder line? And if so, how do you address that?
I think they have taken a harder line because there's nothing more embarrassing than negotiating a consent decree and having it fail. And you could see that in some past cases, whether it's the grocery store that couldn't be sold, nobody wanted to buy it across the parking lot from Whole Foods, for example, or any number of examples where the assets would just fail in somebody else's hands. So I think the agencies, especially with their retrospective at the FTC, look very carefully, and they really want a buyer, as you know, who can step into the shoes of the seller and compete and be viable, which means that oftentimes it's got to be an ongoing operation. It can't be that much of a mix and match, and they're just going to be very careful.
Right, that certainly makes sense. Following up on that timing, that seems to be an area where you just look at the stats and competitively sensitive deals are taking longer and longer to get to resolution, whether it's clearance, whether it's litigation. What have you seen there? To the extent you've seen timing drag out, what do you attribute that to?
So I think it's clear that second requests are taking longer, and part of that is a function of we're just in a data society where there's just so much electronic data that it takes a long time to produce it, review it. So that's one issue. There's just a lot more paper, or the equivalent of paper. The other is that the agencies are using timing agreements to a large extent in most transactions. And this is a practice that I actually can't stand because obviously Hart-Scott provides for a 30-day waiting period, and the parties can negotiate to give the agencies more time by agreement, but having a timing agreement conditioned upon you have to enter into the timing agreement or we won't do any modifications to the second request is very painful and does extend that time period.
Right. So the agencies have used that process to move timing agreements from something that are voluntary to something that are basically required to the extent you want to do anything, whether it's mods the second request, whether it's meetings with front office, things you would expect to be able to do.
Right. Now, what I would say is that while second requests are taking longer, I think the agencies, or certain portions of the agencies, not every section, are getting better at evaluating transactions that look like they have antitrust issues, but if you actually look at the economics, or you look at the natural experiments, or you actually look at the documents, you see that the issues don't exist. So even there are situations where they're resolving their concerns in a shorter period of time. But if they have the concerns, then you're in it for a while.
Makes sense. International coordination, another hot topic, especially as deals get bigger, global deals, you're notifying in 20, 30, 40 jurisdictions, a lot of coordination there, one would hope, one would expect. What have you seen there to the extent coordination has increased between the agencies? Is that something that's positive? Is that helpful for getting deals done? Can that be a problem? How do you approach that question?
I hate to approach that question, actually, because I find it problematic when the agencies coordinate when there's no reason to. So obviously in a situation where you have world markets and the issues are common across jurisdictions, it makes sense to coordinate and actually can be efficient. You can make a single presentation or use the same presentation in multiple areas. The agencies can cross-pollinate with their various levels of knowledge and expertise. On the other hand, where you have a situation where the products may be the same, but it's a different geographic markets and the market behavior is different, the coordination only results in delay. And so what I've found recently is that because there's a best practice at the agencies to coordinate with the foreign agencies, if they do that and they start lining up the timing, when the issues don't line up, somebody's going to face a delay.
Right.
And given how long, whether it's a long second request here, delaying Europe, or a long phase 2 in Europe, delaying the United States, that's a problem. And then obviously agencies outside the United States and Europe, some of them have different standards and the timing doesn't always mesh up. So it's a real issue. So for clients, we really have to make sure, obviously the drop dead date is way out, and also make sure that we have some game plan for dealing with these disparate schedules.
Right, no question, challenge. Because it's a spring meeting and because we have a new administration coming in, have to ask, what are your expectations for the agencies going forward? What do you expect to see? And obviously this is difficult because the personnel is in flux and policies are in flux, but what would you expect to see over the next 12, 24 months that might be different than what we've seen in the past 12 or 24? What might be the same? What are you looking for?
So it's what would I expect to see and what would I like to see? What I would expect to see is it's a Republican administration and generally some areas become a little bit more lax, consistent with the economics that most of those administrations have followed. So my guess is there'll probably be less vertical concerns and maybe more leeway with concentrated markets horizontally. So maybe not worry about the 5 to 4s or the 4 to 3s. And sometimes I've seen some cases with 6 to 5, 6 firms merging to 5 in an industry and focus more on the 3 to 2s or the 2 to 1s. So I think we'll probably see some of that. What I would like to see is, I don't think I will see it, but what I'd like to see is maybe a greater ability to argue the pro-competitive efficiencies actually outweigh the anti-competitive harm and not have them treated with a skepticism that's not only in the guidelines, but in the agency's economist's mind often. I'd also like to see those efficiencies, the debate actually take place as to whether out-of-market efficiencies count or not.
Right. And that seems like a big issue.
It is a big issue, and there are a lot of times where the marketplace is so benefited from a transaction, and it happens not to be in the little area where there's an antitrust issue, and it doesn't seem appropriate to just totally ignore those benefits and stop the transaction.
Right. I know the guidelines refer to out-of-market efficiencies a bit, but it's something about they have to outweigh the anti-competitive effects by a great amount, or it's the standard is.
Yeah, but I think in practice, they're not taken into account in my experience.
Right. Certainly an issue, and certainly going to be something to look for. Last question. State AGs. To the extent we see the federal agencies maybe take a step back, whether it's on vertical issues, whether it's on horizontal issues, can you see a scenario where state AGs kind of pick up the slack, where they become more aggressive, especially maybe like blue state AGs? Is that a realistic scenario? Is that something that's still relatively unlikely? Too early to tell. How do you think about that question?
I think it's a great question, because I think that that is a protection for consumers if the federal agencies become more lax during any administration. And I don't know that I've ever followed it with respect to a particular administration, but I have seen state agencies do things that the federal government was unwilling to do. It's happened in grocery store cases. It's happened in some forms of conduct investigations. So I would not be surprised if the state agencies, the blue state agencies, if they actually do pick up any slack that occurs. Obviously, it's got to be of political interest, it's got to be of consumer interest, and it's got to be state-centric. But I think it could very well happen.
It's going to be interesting to monitor. Obviously, resource constraints on the state side as well.
Yes.
Perfect. Cliff, that is all we had. Thank you so much for being here. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you very much.